I'm now going to introduce right up our next panel, and I'd like to call up to the stage David Brin and Anita Allen. The next panel is called Will There Be Privacy in the Transparent Society? And let me introduce our two speakers. David Brin, I think you can tell which is which. David Brin is an astrophysicist. He has a PhD in astrophysics. He did his dissertation on comets. He's a visiting scholar at NASA in something called exobiology. I'll look it up. He's also written over 20 science fiction novels, including Earth, which is one of the great texts on privacy that you will ever read. If you want to learn a lot about privacy, I would say that the novel Earth is one of the best places you might turn to. He's also written The Postman, which was made into a movie of ignominious repute by who?
Costner.
Yeah, that guy, Costner. And his novels have won 1 Nebula Award, 2 Hugo Awards, and 4 Locus Awards.
Three Hugos.
3. We have it wrong. I apologize. 3 Locus Awards. Another one soon to come. He's also the author of The Transparent Society, Will Technology Force Us to Choose Between Freedom and Philosophy, which has won other important awards and is, I think, one of the truly important and great books on the question of privacy in our time. With me moderating and talking to David will be Anita Allen, who's also going to be speaking later today. She's the Henry R. Silverman Professor of Law and Philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania. She's a JD from Harvard and a PhD in philosophy from Michigan. Love the joint philosophy JD degree. She's written numerous books and voluminous articles, including many of the most important entries on privacy in all the academic encyclopedias. Her books include Unpopular Privacy, What We Must Hide, and Why Privacy Isn't Everything, Feminist Reflections on Personal Accountability. So we're going to start with David Brin. I welcome him.
The format is a little bit odd here, but I think I can look at the screen here. I wasn't exactly sure what the format is, so what I'm going to do is I need clicker.
You need a clicker.
Clicker. I need to. I guess I can go over there and tap the.
Can I take out the? We're going to have to help you with the clicker.
Right.
So you start, and I'll click.
I'll just use the podium and have it.
What?
It's fine. Sorry. Not a problem. The topic is huge. It's terribly important. It's related to all the things that make our civilization function. And we have a very unusual civilization. If you look across, I'm paid to have big picture perspective, and most science fiction authors are not scientists, they are amateur historians. Because that's what science fiction does. It attempts to extend the great drama of who and what we were and the mistakes we made. And across 6,000 years, the biggest mistake we made was pyramidal-shaped social structures, in which a few dominated over the masses, and thereby were able to cheat and destroy opportunity for all other people, because it was to their own best interests, because then they could monopolize resources and maximize their reproductive success, all those things. We're the world's first diamond-shaped social structure, in which, in theory, and to some large extent in practice, a well-off, empowered, and free society of middle-class individuals is unafraid of the rich and outnumbers the poor. And the implications are staggering. That could take an hour in itself. And because it's a panel discussion, I'm going to race through my slides. But I'd like you to keep that in the context. Because, as Roger said, none of those pyramidal societies had any privacy at all. They were dominated by the Lord on the Hill and his thugs, and by the petty bullying of the local gossip. And it is only this recent society that has made an effort in the direction of achieving these desiderata that Roger and President Botstein were talking about. Now, I'm going to hurry through these slides because I would like to be a courteous member of a panel, but we'll see how things go, and you can ask questions about some of them. There's lots to do. We have to deal with hunger and poverty and infrastructure and spreading deserts and filth that we're spreading. There's the potential always for revolution, which we in this generation have not had to worry about, but certainly Bernie Sanders is reminding us of. And then there are the potentialities of disasters that are outside of our control. Asteroids and global climate change, well, that's partly in our control. But things that we have to take care of. But let's focus in on privacy. Hannah Arendt says that privacy guards the dark recesses of the human heart. Everything that lives has to move toward the light, but it has to have dark roots. But here's the important point, and Roger made this point, but I think it needs to be redoubled. Hannah Arendt was no nostalgist. She knew about those 6,000 years of utter horror, unrelieved horror. She was a refugee from it. She considered the American experiment to be paradise. She appreciated modernity's gift of privacy and freedom. And this is something that we have to resist, is the notion of nostalgia that we see rife across both ends of the political spectrum. All right, one end is more dangerous and crazy than the other, fine. But the temptations and the allure of nostalgia and renunciation, anti-tech, and all of those things are rife at both ends. And we need to remember that as you hear many of the speakers here, as Roger just emphasized, as President Botstein emphasized, nobody here is going to argue that, except maybe Scott McNeely, and he's not here, that we should shrug away privacy. In my opinion, all right, so as a sci-fi author and a philosopher, I'm interested in the big picture and all these things. And as the son of a poet and a poet myself, I'm interested in the poetical aspects of privacy and all those things. But when you get right down to it, I'm a physicist. How are we going to preserve this in the face of what I'm about to show you? Now, here's the fundamental dilemma, and it starts with science fiction. Orwell, the best example ever of a self-preventing prophecy. Now roll that over in your head. A self-preventing prophecy. That's a science fiction story mostly, although it used to be allegories. That is so powerful that it girds millions of people with the metaphors they need to fight to prevent the scary story from coming true. Soylent Green recruited tens of millions of environmentalists. Dr. Strangelove helped to prevent World War III. But above all, Orwell equips us to fight against tyranny, and has for 70 years. And if you are a sane person on the conservative, you tend to think that Big Brother is coming from snooty academics and faceless government bureaucrats. If you're a person somewhat of the left, you think that Big Brother is coming, you accuse Big Brother of coming from aristocrats and faceless corporations. To which the proper answer is, duh! Cheaters will find whatever area on the horizon is not being guarded against cheating. That's the lesson of 6,000 years. And it's not that both sides are wrong, one side or another has a monopoly on where Big Brother could come from. It's that the destruction of politics and our ability to say, well, I see your point about my side. That, in my opinion, has been a conspiracy. So, all right, you have Big Brother as a central metaphor for what can happen. And now I think I'm behind. There we go. Now we have omnivalence. We have the cameras sprouting everywhere. I started writing the Transparent Society back when I lived in England in 1987. I started writing notes because England was getting cameras everywhere. And it's been proliferating. And what we have is Moore's law of cameras. It's a corollary to Moore's law, some name it after me, and that is that every year the cameras get smaller, faster, cheaper, more mobile, and better, at a rate faster than Moore's law. And we've got to stop whining. We are constrained by technology. That does not mean we are foreordained to a specific destiny by technology, but we have to understand the constraints. You will not prevent this. The cameras will get smaller, and people will be walking down the street. You hated Google Glass? Sorry. There will be a tiny button on the corner of people's eyeglasses, and it will be writing information on the inside of the eyeglasses, and you will have a name tag under you. The decisions we're going to make in law and all of that will determine how many people have this. You can pass a law that will prevent you from having it. You will not stop elites from having it. Name for me one time in human history when elites allowed themselves to be blinded. And if you believe it's possible, please take, this is an assignment, go down to the Bronx Zoo with a pointed stick, climb into the baboon enclosure, and poke out the eyes of the biggest baboon. He won't let you. On the other hand, a reflexive hatred of technology is also our enemy. 2013 was the best year for human rights in America in 3 decades. And it was hidden from you by the media and everyone else. The fact of the matter is that 2013 was the year that the Obama administration joined with court decisions and declared it is an absolute and irrevocable American right that if you are not directly interfering with the police, you can record the police in public. Until that point, states all over, left and right, Chicago, were passing laws allowing the police to seize your cell phones and your cameras. It was an absolutely vital event, and it was unspoken of because it was good news and did not fit the narrative. And it led to the Black Lives Matter, which is a chant. Fine, it's a great chant, but it should be accompanied by, give us more tech. We want GoPros for all our young men so that when they're rousted, their hands can be free instead of aiming a cell phone that can be mistaken for something else. We want lapel cams for all of them, going directly to the cloud. Then things will change, and they are changing even without that. Now, this is just an example of something that's been going on for 500 years. Sometimes I make complicated PowerPoint slides. I'm very counter-trend. 500 years ago, we got glass lenses, movable type, perspective. And what these were augmentations, exponentiations of what people can see, what they can know, what they can attend to and reach. And every single time, what happened was, Grouches said, people can't deal with this. God did not make, or evolution did not make people capable of dealing with this fire hose of information. And every time there were transcendentalists who said, oh, this is going to make everyone better because we'll know more. People will know more. They'll have more empathy. They'll understand the horizons of inclusion of other people and understand other cultures. And always the Grouches were right in the short term. The printing presses spread horrible religious tracts that exacerbated the 30 Years' War and the rampages across Europe. But eventually, people got more books and it did spread their sense of empathy. The same thing happened with newspapers, mass literacy, especially radio and loudspeakers, which amplified the human voice to godlike proportions. And horrible tyrants used this to mesmerize populations all over the world. And only in the English-speaking world did these mesmerizing folks on radio happen to be on our side. Or maybe that was our wisdom in choosing them to be our mesmerizers. FDR, Churchill. Other than that, it was a dive into hell until people got inoculated and were able to say, just because his voice is loud, that doesn't mean he's right. We're right now going through another of these, and it's not a fire hose, it's a tsunami. And those who would stand like King Canute and say, stop, or what was it Buckley said, stand athwart history with my hand out saying stop, are not going to succeed. We have to learn to surf. But can we? The next amplification is certainly going to challenge us. Steve Mann of Toronto, you can see the evolution of wearables until they're almost disappearing. Star Trek, back in 1994, now look at this image. They're holding out what really seems like they're just holding the wrong side forward. Our cell cams, the way we do it. But look at the guys on the right and the left. 1994. Now look at this guy. Yes, he's my distant cousin. That and $3.65 will get me a small latte at Starbucks. And what are we going to see in the near future? Well, this is a character from my novel Existence. You go to my website, you can watch a 3-minute video trailer. That's more fun than anything else you'll do in 3 minutes, at least clothed. But we are already enhancing ourselves. We are already enhancing ourselves with prosthetics of vision, memory, and attention that are far beyond. What are those little things sticking out of our head? Those are little gel cameras that can look in all directions. If you're a short person, you'll never be lost behind a crowd again, and you'll never have to hold up your cell phone. Detecting possible threats. What I didn't include is the possibility that any of us will have mini drones that can go around that dark alley and see what's waiting for us. Or detect if anybody's following us home. The obvious benefits to this are huge, but also the obvious challenges, like when the little drones fight. But then again, we had that problem with dogs on a leash. We coped. We moved on. Now, there's my book. What's happening is that the clues are all around us, and the clues are in your pocket. What is all this? What is all this crap? These are prosthetics for reputation. It used to be, why can the average human know from 1,000 to 10,000 people? And that's max. Really gregarious person can know at maximum 10,000 people. Because that's what we needed in the olden times. And you would go from your village with a cart of goods to the local town, and the people in the town knew you, and you would swap a couple bushels of grain for some horseshoes, or just say, I'll bring a couple bushels of grain next week, and take the horseshoes. That was commerce, because that was your reputation. And these are all prosthetics for reputation. But in the future, we're going to have to choose between two kinds of future. The kind where technology, in the darker visions of science fiction, hijacks our children, as it's already doing with video games. And we have to deal with that potential addiction like all the others that we've had to overcome. Or whether we become empowered individuals that, yes, Roger, we will be different in our definition of human. I'm going to be giving a talk in Amsterdam in a week. We are redefining human. And some people like Francis Fukuyama and some of the other grouches believe that this will be terrible. But we've already done it many times. And at some point, we may reach the threshold where the grouches are right permanently. And this could help explain why we haven't seen extraterrestrial intelligence. But so far, every time we've done this, we've managed, in this revolution, to prevail. No, what we're seeing is when you're walking down the street and you have an invisible lens that checks everyone's faces, on the inside of your lens, everyone will have name tags. And you'll never be at a loss for who they are ever again. You can have 2 lines of notes that you typed out 5 years ago about this person. Oh, hey, Fred, how's that dog of yours? You had no idea who he was by sight. Or 2 lines of that person's printing public profile, or 2 lines of dissenting opinions from his ex-spouse. You'll be able to choose what information you get, and yes, it will be different. And yes, it will threaten our notions of privacy. But I am coming full circle back to privacy because it is important. There is 0 choice in getting what I just described. You can refuse to wear such glasses. You can talk to your neighbors and pass laws against such glasses, in which case elites will have those glasses, and gods will walk among us. Or we can all have those glasses and decide which village we're going to live in. Now, the villages of our ancestors, 99% of them were horrible. I don't know if anybody recognizes this. It's a scene from the village from The Prisoner from the 1960s. And that's an extremum. You can have the village in which our ancestors lived. Lord on the hill, thugs, and worst of all, the local gossip who terrorized our ancestors. Do you think I want that just because I wrote a book called The Transparent Society? I'm as paranoid against both Big Brother and tyranny by homogenizing, conformity enforcing 51% little brothers as possible. Hannah Arendt talked about Periclean Athens. So do I. The fact is that it did not end when Sparta conquered Athens. Within 10 years, Thrasybulus had raised up an army and kicked the Spartans out. Democracy continued. And yet, the 51% conformity enforcers killed Socrates. Either way, you get terror and an end to our dream. The only way we're going to have these dark spaces of the human soul, when the power to see is so strong, is if you as a citizen have the sovereign, assertive, and technologically backed ability to look at your neighbors and say, I'm not doing anything within the realm of harm that is any of your business. Myob. Mind your own business. Get out of my face. And you can only do this if, as Roger said, we have a movement towards what we already have. And that's a growing public sense of leaving each other alone for non-harmful things. The more we learn about non-harmful minorities, for example, like gays, the more we tolerate them, except if they're harmful. The more we learn about the Ku Klux Klan, the less we tolerate them. It is the criterion. And if I sound like a Pollyanna fizzing with optimism, it's because I'm contrarian. You have got to wake up and smell some of the good news. We are trying to develop a zeitgeist, a methodology, a way of living with each other in the light. And that has got to include some privacy. It's got to include a curtilage of being left alone. Chapter 4 of the Transparent Society is about how important privacy is. But we're going to have to redefine it. It's going to have to be closer in. We're going to have to fight for laws protecting the boundaries of the home. But to recognize that our demand that nobody look is philosophically difficult to enforce. Metaphysically, how can you base your freedom on what someone else does not know? But you can have some power over what someone else, even the government, does. And in order to do that, you have to see. And the important thing to deal with Big Brother is to hold them accountable. This is the image of the other village. Who can recognize it? The Andy Hardy movies from the 1930s, Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland, you've got to rent a couple, in which in the village, everyone knows mostly about everyone else, but everyone's an eccentric, and you defend each other's eccentricities and rights because yours depend upon that reflex. And when the poor family across the railroad tracks is starving, hey, everybody, let's put on a show. We do have some choice, but the narcissist narrative is no one else, certainly not my sheep-like neighbors, could possibly want to defend freedom, individuality, and eccentricity as much as I do. Hollywood has preached this. Hollywood has preached your neighbors are sheep, and they're not. Most of them share your fear of Big Brother. Most of them share your basic reflexes. And you have a huge number of allies there if you stop demeaning them. And the other narcissism is, I can stop others, even elites, from doing harm and invading my privacy by yelling at them not to look at me. Snowden talks about how important privacy is, but how? Well, one thing we do is we breed Snowdens. Our mythologies, look at the movies that you watch, almost all of them. The principal messages are suspicion of authority, tolerance, diversity, and eccentricity. Parse it out. It's a propaganda message you've been suckling since you were youth. And most movies convey these. Unfortunately, they also convey the noxious notions that your neighbors are sheep and no institution can ever be trusted. Those are your 6 propaganda messages. 7. I defy you to find counterexamples. Well, I'm going to move around very quickly. There's a term, surveillance, S-O-U-S valence, and that is, surveillance is a French word looking down at you from above. Surveillance should be a rallying cry because it is looking back at elites from below. And I don't have time to go into any of the details about how we're going to do that, but it is happening, and it needs to happen more. And that is where we need to be aggressive, militant. And that is to say to all elites, corporate, governmental, criminal, that because you are elites, and this is already enshrined in both common and statutory law, you are seeking power. That means that you have capabilities to cheat. You are going to be subjected to more view. Teach children sensible reticence and respect for the reticence of others. And then reciprocal accountability toward our neighbors when they are too judgmental or too nosy. Some of you remember, and here's another homework assignment, one that I take more seriously than poking the eye out of a baboon. Go online and watch a video of Gene C. Riley's 1950s song, Harper Valley PTA. Some of you are chuckling, because that's how it's done with the little brothers in conformity. Continue to foster a culture of respect for diversity, freedom, non-harmful eccentricity, and leaving each other alone. But this is a task for active citizenship, not protected clients. And then we can make a difference between the 2 long-range visions of science fiction, whether we're going to be heading into hell or whether we're going to be heading into a future that our children will be proud of.
Thank you to David Brin. We have about half an hour for questions. We might go a little over, we'll see. I have Anita Allen here as well, and the 2 of us are going to ask 1 or 2 questions to get us started, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. Again, if you want to ask a question over Twitter, you can tweet the Arendt Center, and I will try and take something from there as well. I think we have microphones that will go through the audience, right, David? So if you do get asked a question, they'll get a microphone. So I'll start it, and then I'll have Anita ask a question. David, your work is so provocative and wonderful. Your book Earth has an encounter in it that has had me thinking a lot. You have a character named Remy, and Remy is one of 3 young teenagers who hates the adult world, and they distrust the adult world, and all the grannies are watching them with their eyes, views, and true view cameras and reporting every little thing they do. And they meet someone who they think is watching them, and they get very upset, but it turns out that the person watching them just is interested in them and doesn't want to report them. And it turns out he was a veteran of some big war, I think the Helvetian War, which we all should know about.
That's weird.
Is that right?
Yeah, Helvetian War. It's a war. It's the war of 20 developing nations against Switzerland.
Yeah. Over the next couple of weeks, they start to befriend Remy, and he befriends them, and he starts telling them his history, and they tell him everything that they're thinking, and he becomes like the first friend they've had because they actually talk, right, in a world in which nobody talks. I was talking about that earlier. And then Remy doesn't show up, and they do a search, and it turns out he's died. And then they realize he's posted video of every conversation they've had on the web. And they are just flabbergasted.
The betrayal.
Well, and Remy commits suicide.
Right.
And you have a very obviously optimistic view of technology in some ways. And I thought this was so interesting because clearly, right, here's a fear. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little about the character Remy and what he means to you in your thought.
I'm very glad you raised that because as a contrarian, I find I'm very uncomfortable with one track of ideology or thought. And I think that this is a reflex we all need. And in the case of Earth, clearly I was trying, this was long before the Transparent Society. It had climate change, and some of my friends actually keep a wiki tracking predictions from that one novel. Clearly, I was talking about the value of transparency then in preventing both Big Brother and conformity. And yet, the scenes with Remy show that at the time, I knew damned well there was one major exception, and that's shy people. I do not know what to do about that, because let's say we have a transparent society in which elites are prevented from ever making the pyramid again because we keep an eye on them. We keep an eye on cheating. With corporations, we go back to antitrust, for example. All right, fine. And we can prevent busybodies from invading our curtilage, and we can prevent tyranny of conformity. So we've got eccentricity sussed as well. But this is going to be a rough world for people who don't want to stand up and say, Mayab, get out of my face. Who can't stand up at a PTA meeting and fight back. And in that scene, what I'm doing is I'm portraying the horror of such a person when they realize that they were just opened their heart to somebody, and that somebody is from a different era and has different values, and simply used them and made a TV show about them. And for the 90% of you young people out there who are exhibitionists, it might have been something to be proud of. But for him, it was a reason to end it all. The answer is basically that we have to be a civilization that's also has compassion, in which your neighbors will stand up for you and say, leave this person alone. Can't you see she can't stand up here in this light? Get out of her face. Mind your own business.
Do you want to?
Yeah, thanks. So I'm really excited to be here. Thank you. And I'm looking forward to my talk this afternoon, which is going to be about the declining significance of the household or the home as the place where we can be guaranteed privacy. There's some real threats happening, both by virtue of law and by virtue of business and by virtue of how we treat one another. So I'm really excited about that. What I want to ask you about, because is the notion of village. You know, you evoke the notion of village, and the notion of village is for me a very scary idea. Okay, and it's a scary idea because what it brings to mind, among other things, is the problem that we discussed earlier, having to do with Hannah Arendt and how she came from Europe and joined an American village and could not, for the life of her, comprehend the predicament of African Americans in that village. So much so that she said, "Oh, everybody should just enjoy privacy, and the government shouldn't be trying to force us to open up the schools for people based on regardless of their race, because if people want to be prejudiced and raise their children as racist and segregationists, that's okay." And what she didn't understand was the context and how that context felt for other people with whom she shared the village. So I'm wondering, what is your notion of how people living in these sort of in any community, whether it's a small one or a large one, how do they negotiate? How do they deal with their differences? And you said at one point in your talk, Black Lives Matter. Well, they do matter, and yet someone as smart and brilliant as Hannah Arendt, who maybe didn't quite count as an elite, but she was a very smart person, didn't have the capacity at that time to understand the pain, the suffering of black families. Moreover, she didn't have the facts in front of her. She didn't realize that the alternative to integration was to have black kids go to schools in Alabama with used textbooks and no heating. Like my mother, right? And when she criticized black women and black mothers for putting their children on the front lines, what she couldn't comprehend is that those mothers, like my mother, knew that if I didn't go on the front lines, that I would never be able to achieve full citizenship and full dignity. I don't trust the village. I'm skeptical of the village as anything like a remedy or a solution or a context in which we can succeed. And yet, what's the alternative, right, to the village? So I just love your comments, because, I love science fiction. I love your work. And science fiction frightens me, but God, the real world frightens me too.
Well, I think it's terribly important to be frightened as much as you calmly decide is useful to you. Because every now and then you should turn around, because we have this habit in our society. As Peter Diamandis points out in his hyper-optimistic book, Abundance, we have a tendency to ignore the good news because we're descended from the ones back in the savannah who, when they heard a rustle in the grass, thought, that could be a lion, and left. So we worry. I did not say that the village was something I'm prescribing. I like urban life. I'm saying that the village is technologically unavoidable, but we can still fight for which village it is. And we can fight for it to be the kind of village that is only an epiphenomena to some degree of America and was exaggerated in those Andy Hardy movies, in which our horizons of inclusion keep moving outward. And this is an epiphenomenon of science fiction, in that right now it is the horizons of inclusion that is the American experience, is as the fear level goes down, the horizons move outward. So that the founders of America thought they were very revolutionary, and with it, because they were expanding power to other Englishmen who did not have titles. And then the Jacksonian Revolution expanded it to Scots-Irish. And then we went through a real major violent tussle over partially expanding the horizon to all males. And then you move onward and onward to feminism and all that. And now the horizons are arguments over whether or not animals deserve rights. Well, that's in the theory. We're still inward from those horizons, fighting the fights over how to reify and make practically effective the inclusion battles of a previous generation. And one example is the is page 160 of the Transparent Society, 1997. It has a page describing a street scene where a cop who has to wear a cop cam asks a ghetto youth to get out of the car, and he's wearing a cam. And they're both reporting to their home VCRs, excuse me, it was 1997, to the cloud. and the result is better policing, far less injustice, but a golden age of sarcasm. And the point is that everyone was predicting that, yes, Obama, yes, courts, you have ruled that you have a right to, but now all the cameras will be accidentally smashed, right? But what we didn't expect, what I expected, but it would take a few years, what I didn't expect was before the end of 2013, we got to see a man in an orange prison jumpsuit being sentenced to 3 years in prison for lying about smashing the camera of the man he was arresting because someone else had a camera. I'm not saying that the village doesn't have its fears, but when it comes down to what Hannah Arendt didn't understand was that when you're doing this process of horizon expansion, there is a pragmatic penumbra phase in which you have to push too far the other way. Nobody's more disgusted with political correctness police than I am. But I answer the people who rave about this. Our children will take for granted the reforms and they'll back off from this excess. Right now, we have to do this.
I'd love to ask you a question. So I think I love this camera versus camera, and I do think that it's important that if we can watch the police and they watch us and we have recordings, it might be able to reveal more clearly the limits of, or the extent of abuse. But I have a friend in New York who's a homicide DA, and sometimes he comes to speak to my privacy law classes, and he says, you know, we the prosecutors and police, we love technology because it helps us to put the kids in jail easier. So the kids carry around their cell phones and they're like taking pictures of themselves with the murder weapon, you know, me and the other, and the co-defendants were here. So that because of the use of cameras, it's so pervasive, and because young people are so voyeuristic and also so narcissistic, they create the evidence in their own lives of social nonconformity. Some of which is benign, eccentric, some of which is dangerous, criminal, and will subject them to prosecution. It's kind of a dilemma, right? Because on the one hand, we think that technology can defend us against authority when we need to be defended, but also technology is getting an awful lot of us in trouble as we record and document our misconduct and our difference.
And this is very important because the technological trends I described in a tyranny will reinforce tyranny. You will not be able to, in China or Russia, take pictures of the police. For one thing, they'll just smash your head in. But if you bring the evidence to the press, for example, you're not going to get anywhere. The press is all owned by Putin. The technological trends that I'm talking about will only help us to stave off Big Brother and to stave off conformity if we have a social compact that agrees that they should. Now, I pointed out a couple of examples where I believe we are heading in that direction. Our children are right now wagering. They're betting with all their Instagram photos on a future where 20 years from now, the stuff that they know now they will be ashamed of, you'll be able to say, all right, I was an idiot. And people will roll their eyes and shrug, and that will be it. The distinction between the ones taking selfies inside the liquor store, the window they smashed, and the ones who are taking the selfies hanging off the edge of a bridge, mooning cars, which is illegal. The whole notion is that we have a civilization in which the judge or the jury, when you're hanging off a bridge, moving cars go like this. Remanded to, covering graffiti. Grow up in a sliding scale. If we have that kind of society, then your question is answered. Do I believe it's automatic? No. You and I are on the same side here. We have to have that value system, or we're screwed.
I'm going to open it up for questions, and and Anita and I will also comment on questions to the extent we can. There's some microphones going around. So one in the back, in the middle of the back there, I see a question. Can you get her a mic? No, but we'd like it mic'd if you could. We don't hear so well.
And besides which, you may not know this, but you're on the air.
Yeah.
Okay, so in a paranoid vision of technology, there has to be a social contract in which we can believe the photographs that we're seeing. I mean, we see pictures of celebrities that are, 50. We don't believe all that smooth skin. I'm a theater person, so you can reenact events. I mean, what you're presenting is a vision in which we can actually believe the information that we're getting. And I'm not arguing here for, let's abolish technology, but how do we trust what we see isn't invented, isn't made up, isn't reenacted? I mean, we can only trust those cameras that the police, that anybody presents, because this is not happening in real time and space, and though one can question if one can always trust what one sees before one's eyes. But if you don't see it before your eyes, it can be an act. It can be a reenactment. It can be theater.
I understand exactly what you're saying. I have a chapter about that in the Transparent Society. The chapter is called The End of Photography as Proof of Anything at All. And at first it looks dangerous, especially when the cop cams are bringing in evidence. Right now, the police departments do not have the ability to fudge the photography. They probably won't for some years. And they know that the civil libertarians in the NGOs, and that is our secret weapon in this whole tussle of elites, is the fact that we are creating this vast array of powerful NGOs that each of you can be members of. You can give your $20 a year dues to a dozen NGOs that cover your passions. And if you're not doing that minimum amount, then you're part of the problem. I'm serious. Look up my name in proxy activism. You'll get a real finger wag, because it's the lazy person's way of saving the world. 12 organizations.
There's a whole literature among technologists about the question of whether it's a good thing or a bad thing to have a lot of life logging and wearable computers, because, again, there's this record of you. And the question has been raised, should there be technologies that deliberately insert falsehood into what would otherwise be a veridical log in order to protect people from disclosure? And I think it's a very clever thought that you'd have a life log. It would record most of your life accurately, but occasionally it would throw in a picture of you having Starbucks one day when you didn't have Starbucks. And then that couldn't be used as evidence against you in court because the tape is not completely accurate.
Well,
by design.
This has been put out in several novels. Charles Stross, Werner Vinge had terrorists called the Friends of Privacy, who spewed out so much garbage into the internet that nobody could ever trust anything they looked up ever again. But you see, there's an answer to this. And I point this out at the end of the chapter. The answer is the same as when you have unreliable human witnesses. Everything is made better by more witnesses. I just cited an example. The policeman was saying, the guy tripped and he dropped his camera. No, someone else was watching. And when you have this Moore's law of cameras, you are going to have the fact that the people who are fabulating the evidence can't know that somebody else recorded the same scene. And that is going to be the fundamental reason why the police forces aren't going to do this when they get the technology. Because somebody else on a street corner or up a window with a little drone is going to be able to dispute them. And that's why the technologies have to be democratized. That's why we have to have them. And then we have to have the detectors so that you can detect if somebody's flown a little spy drone into your bedroom. And you can follow the signals back to the home of that pimple-faced voyeur, knock on his door, and tell his mom.
We'll take another question. Here on the, yes, you.
What you're describing here is something like an agonistic, confrontational, self-interested, individualistic ontology, okay? And at the same time saying we have to act like a community.
And your alternative is paternalism? Your paternalism is European style?
No, my alternative
the state?
is nothing like that. My alternative is interrogating other understandings of the self that are not so agonistic, individualistic, and
I'm sorry, that's preaching.
And that exists. Just because we don't do it doesn't mean it can't be done. How we do it, if I had the answer, I'd be sitting up there instead of back here. I have ideas. But I think that I never thought I would say I'm somehow on the same side as Francis Fukuyama. I never thought those words would ever come out of my mouth. But this society of constant surveillance that you're speaking of, maybe it is, but it seems to be embedded in this notion of confrontation, agonism, and self-interest always. And I don't know how from that you then get, we have to stand up with each other and in community act together and have empathy for others.
And I don't understand how you can say that living in freedom and privacy and security and more fun and more tolerance than any other human civilization when it's based exactly on what I'm talking about. We can stand up for ourselves. If you catch somebody abusing you, you can call in help. What I don't understand is how we're going to go back to 6,000 years of Confucian and Aristotelian and Aquinian and all that preaching. Be nice to each other. Be nice. That has never worked. The only thing that worked was what Pericles talked about in his funeral oration. And that is our ability to stand up and say, my turn, I will protect your eccentricities. I will protect your differences because you're going to protect mine. And we stand in the light. And that's how we got what we got. That's how you got what you have now.
That's right. That's how I got what I have now. But I don't think Anita Allen's mother has that same privilege.
I'm sorry?
From the way you spoke of your mother, Dr. Allen. I'm very proud.
And yes, that's right. And we're dealing with it. We're expanding our horizons outward. And it's not sweet.
We'll take
Well, I will have my opportunity this afternoon to respond in full, and I really appreciate both sides of this conversation. I do think that there's a room for ethics and virtue and, pardon my expression, preaching. I do think that preaching or teaching the importance of ethical reserve is a very important thing to building communities that are functional. And that can't all be about confrontation and mutual surveillance. But I'll have my turn later today, so I don't want to take up too much time.
Gee, I mean, usually what happens is I'm portrayed as somebody who's anti-privacy. Now I'm being portrayed as everything's got to be confrontational. I believe that we will have the spaces and even the darkness that Hannah Arendt talked about. Because we will teach our children to respect each other.
We can teach our children, but we all are going to teach them and they're going to know that there is no place that is private except based on trust. And how are we going to, I mean, you mentioned trust in another talk you gave the other day. Where is this trust going to come from in your account?
It comes from knowing that you're safe. Look, you start with being safe and free. If you're safe and free, then you can argue with your neighbors how to define and redefine the contingent rights like privacy and property. But the fundamental rights that at first were just given to middle-class Englishmen, but then to the Scots-Irish and all that as we expanded outward. The primary rights to know and to argue and to confront people who would harm you. These are the primary things that will enable our children, and they'll be smarter than us, to come up with their own definitions of privacy, their own definitions of property.
Right. We have a question from Twitter for you, which is, David, how is the idea of all wear glass to keep elites, Google Glass, to keep elites in line, different from all carry guns to protect ourselves against murderers?
Excellent question, excellent question. What we're seeing on our streets right now is that these cell phone cameras are the new great equalizer, that the Colt 45 supposedly was but wasn't in the Old West. The difference is that when you feel an affront and you whip out a camera and you find out you were wrong, you can apologize. When you whip out a Colt 45 and you were wrong, you try to apologize on the gallows. And what's more is the first draw doesn't win with cameras. It's who's right. Now, that does presuppose that the general jury of people out there are not conformity enforcers, that they're not what you were talking about, judgmentally quashing eccentricity. If this only works if we generate a general sense that harmfulness is the thing, when it's revealed on camera, is the worst thing.
We have a question up right there, your hand up. It's been up for a while. Could we get a microphone?
Thanks. I'm so glad I got in because my question really builds on some of the themes that were introduced earlier.
I see your name is...
I'm Dawn.
I'm kidding.
Oh,
I don't
sorry.
have it.
Oh, haha, no, I got it. I got it. So I think your response that we start from a place of safety and freedom really betrays your own subject position in addressing these matters, right, as a white male. And if there is a utopian aspect in your talk and your vision, it seems to me to be the assumption of a uniform application of these powers, right? And I think we have to think about power not just in a vision of sort of top-down, right? Like it either comes from the top of the diamond or it comes from the middle of the diamond, right? Like power operates more as a grid, you know, and a grid that's really intensifying because of these different forms of surveillance that encourage self-regulation in certain ways too. And so my question is really, how does this vision change in light of the fact that, as we can see from the radical exposition of police violence in the past few years and the radical lack of convictions for people who kill, for police who kill, right, that it matters much less what information we have than how the laws come down and are applied?
Great. Thank you.
Well, I think that's an extremely cogent and well-parsed question. I think that what we're seeing is that there is always a very awkward intermediate phase. What's happening, I'm seeing, is a lot of police departments, internal affairs divisions are getting much stronger and they're easing out a lot of the bad cops. And this is something that is in the best interests of the good cops, because as they find themselves more and more exposed on the streets, the old omerta mutual protection thing that caused the good cops to grind their teeth, they're finding a way out now. Now, you say that it's a sexist matter, but I'm finding over the last 20 years that it's very often women who understand the power of accountability and the need for accountability, the need to be able to use light as an equalizer against those who have more physical force than they do. The fact is that there is no other recommendation that I have seen that is going to deliver you the freedom and the safety that we then need in order to have this argument. You and I are having this argument because we're safe and we're free. We don't know the answers to how to deal with this technological drive towards a village, and I may be wrong about that. We don't know how to redefine privacy, although we are trying to find ways of protecting a curtilage around the home and things like that, as Hannah Arendt would recommend. But we do know, as she knew, that these things are gifts of modernity and that nostalgia is not going to help. And I know this. I know my kids' generation is smarter, better, calmer than us boomers. Boy, are you going to be better off without us.
Are there any students? I'd love to take one or two questions right here in the middle. Yes. Wait for a mic down here.
For one thing, our
They're smarter and better than us, so we need to hear from them.
Our generational talent is self-righteous indignation. And I'll fight anybody who... Yeah.
Hi. So I'm just having trouble reconciling this idea that transparency leads to lack of individualism, but then, like, in an ideal world, we will all be eccentric and we'll all be able to protect each other through those eccentricities. But if we are getting increasingly, like, less individual, then how are we going to have eccentricities to protect?
Well, I agree. But always step back. This is a real lesson. I never see this. I'm going to say it to you, say it to all of you young people. Always step back and look at yourself. The concern that you just expressed is a concern that you share with almost everyone else in your generation. Roger was puzzled by 60% of the young people were a little more forgiving than the older people of the NSA. That's because of this thing that I was talking about of where you fear Big Brother is coming from. You young people have a little more of a sense that it's coming from the corporate and oligarchy world, rebuilding the pyramid, than from civil servants. And that's the explanation for why. They don't trust the NSA. They're just a little more concerned right now about Big Brother coming from this other area. So my answer to you is look at yourself. You stood up to ask a very important question that I'm not answering because I find you more fascinating, because you are an example of the fact that you care about that. So if the majority of your peers are free, they will have this argument, and they will have this argument about how to maximize protections of eccentricity.
I've observed young people a little bit because I have a 19-year-old daughter and a 23-year-old son, and I do have the concern that you raised about how one can become an individual, and an eccentric individual at that, in a culture where everything must be shared. You know, I watched my daughter in middle school. Her friends would text each other and send messages all morning about what they were going to wear to school. And everyone had to sort of implicitly conform to a certain set of expectations among their friends. It's not to say that we boomers didn't have our expectations about what we wore to school, but the intensity of information sharing of your generation is astounding to me. And I share the worry that you have that people are going to be too homogenized and too restrained in their self-expression by the hegemony, not of the government or of big business, but of their peers, because you must always be a certain kind of person available to certain other people at certain times of day and night, in certain kinds of ways, and I don't know how you're going to escape that prison. But it's not a prison imposed by government per se. It is a prison imposed by commodity culture, because Facebook is a commodity, Instagram is a commodity, etc. But I would be mindful of that you may be self-imprisoning in cooperation with or in collaboration with the internet commodities.
We'll take one last question, and if there is a student, I'd love to include them.
There's one in the back there. There's two in the back there.
In the back there, in the back row.
But by the way, I hope I've made it clear all through this entire hour that the fear of the homogenization and conformity enforcement is, in my opinion, equal to Big Brother. The little brothers are just as dangerous, and we are skating a minefield. And I have some faith that we can, because of the young people, because they're concerned about this, and because eccentricity and protection of individual difference is important to them.
Okay, great. Our last question.
Wait, is this on? All right. Just to start off, I agree with what you had to say, like on accountability in terms of keeping those who have power, influence, and money like accountable for their actions. But what role does that play for like the common people? Do you feel that that is even necessary for those who lack power, influence, and money?
Well, I think that we can agree here that one of the most amazing things about our culture is that we already had, in both common law and in statutory law, a sliding scale of privacy where a public figure dealing with paparazzi can only sue for trespass and for damage, but not for violation of privacy. Those of you who are meek private individuals, you can actually sue for an invasion of privacy right that the rich and the mighty don't have. Now, this was crude compared to this kind of sliding scale we're going to have to develop. We're going to have to develop multiple ways of doing this, and some are explored in science fiction stories. There's been some very good stuff lately. I do not have an answer to that, but I do know that we have to be the kind of people who care about this living process of redefining privacy as we move forward.